Okay, the last panel looking at bias. Two of these are sort of what I would call bias. Two of them are actually pretty specific to geography. So we're going from sort of the general Western theoretical or intellectual tradition to more specialized. The first is the idea of worldview or cosmology. This isn't really so much a bias per se, until you make assumptions that everyone in a group has the same worldview or cosmology. That gets pretty sketchy pretty fast. Worldview is basically talking about how an individual views everything around them. The key thing with worldview is it always starts with the individual, who we usually term ego. In other words, the person you're talking about could be yourself, for example. And the worldview can almost be seen as like a ripple effect or an onion layers or whatever you call it, where this person at the center, and then it involves everything about the world around them in terms of how they see those things, their relationship with those things, how they view them in terms of active or passive agents. I mean, all that type of stuff is worldview. So worldview is a very encompassing term. But the key is from a social science or behavioral science perspective is worldview is always from the standpoint of an individual. When you see someone talk about a group's worldview, that gets really sketchy really fast. Because at some point, yes, people are part of groups, and groups are a major part of the shaping of human behavior. Think about ethnocentrism. But on the other hand, everyone is an individual. They all negotiate the relationship with the rest of the group from the standpoint of themselves or ego. So worldviews within a group will always be maybe 80, 90, maybe even 95% synonymous. They'll always be sort of, if not exactly the same, incredibly close. But there's always going to be slightly different, views of that just by virtue of how someone was brought up, where they were brought up, who they consider their friends, the way they view the world around them is going to be slightly different. And so worldviews are, on one hand, collective, in the sense that groups have sort of standardized sets of ways of looking at X or Y. On the other hand, they are individualistic. So you always have to be very careful, sort of generalizing about worldview. Cosmology, very much the same thing. Cosmology is sort of the way that people view the cosmos, in the sense of what you might call belief, religion, ritual, and that type of stuff is sort of the cosmology. So if you would, cosmology might be sort of seen as a subset of worldview. Worldview is everything. Cosmology would be those things specifically related to belief, religion, and such that people hold. But again, cosmology is always within the standpoint of the individual, in the sense that you start with one person and you're looking out, again, like a ripple effect. So when you're looking at worldview and cosmology, something you always have to keep in your mind is that there is an inherent bias because of the contradiction of the group on one hand and the perspective of the person you're talking to or who wrote the book or whatever it is, and in the sense that their personal spin on this, if you want to think of it that way. Now, if you're looking at maps, of course, since maps are always drawn by individuals, well, they're drawn by groups, but invariably will be someone who designed the map and actually, let's put this on the map and this is what it'll look like. I don't know what you want to call it, the map maker. So in maps, this is one thing that makes maps, especially physical maps, really interesting in geographers is not only the fact that they exist, they're a map, but also what you actually have is basically a snapshot of someone's worldview or maybe even their cosmology. There are such things as religious maps. And that's handy, especially if you go back in time. So if you look at a map, for example, that someone in, say, Holland, say in Amsterdam, drew of the world, or more accurately, maybe Europe and the Americas in, say, 1640. On one hand, they might have been trying to actually show you what they thought the world looked like. But what you've actually got is a snapshot of their worldview. And this is why you have to remember, till really recently, you'd see maps and it'd be big blank spots with like, here be dragons or something like that. That was because in the view of the guy that drew the map, he really did think that when you got to certain parts of the planet, that you had no clue what was going on there and all sorts of weird shit might be happening. And that would be part of his worldview and it shows up on the map. So maps are really sort of interesting because in some ways what you're actually getting is a snapshot of people's sort of, image of the world, any part of the worldview. Okay, sociobiology is the general one. Sociobiology is one of those concepts, if it's not innate in all human groups, it's certainly in most of them. And sociobiology is the perception that social behavior is actually biologically conditioned and biologically controlled. Now, the classic example of that would be the idea that you breed. So for example, you think of dogs, you breed aggression or you breed certain types of behavior into a variety of dog. And that would be sociobiology. Now, the terrifying part of this, of course, is when you extrapolate it to people, you get rid of all those other things like upbringing and everything else that might be encased. You basically say that everything that I am is a result of my parents and the other people I inherited stuff from. And this is typical in most societies. In the Western tradition, it's certainly true of a huge amount of stuff. I'm thinking of astrology, for example. On one hand, it's based on the universe, if you would. On the other hand, it's based on when you were born, and that shapes X, Y, and Z. Chinese have a very different, but also equally complex view of their Chinese astrology, which is exactly the same. You know, if you're born in a particular day in a particular year, you're going to have certain behavioral traits. Now they see that as coming from your parents, but in a complicated way, it's parents overlaying with, I don't know, the cosmos. So that's sociobiology. Now, on one hand, there's no evidence to support sociobiology in the human species. No, so there's been tons of tests done. People don't inherit behavior. People inherit potential attributes in the sense of maybe better eyesight, better, hand-eye coordination, stuff like that. But they don't inherit being an athlete. They inherit the ability to be an athlete, if you would, in the sense that they have the right type of muscle coordination, et cetera. So, but what happens is for most societies, there's a very strong sense kinship is a huge potential or a huge part of most societies. There's a very strong attitude in most societies that people actually do inherit this. So what you get is something that's not academically or intellectually accurate, but for what you might call sort of popular urban legend type stuff. Almost everyone, especially true here in Hawaii, because Asian traditions are even bigger on this, believe in sociobiology. So, if one of you is, for example, artistic, I can almost guarantee that someone in your family or friends, people are going to say, oh, you must have picked that up from your mom's side of the family because your aunties are, really artistic. So the idea that your artistic ability, your interest in the arts, your ability to do stuff like that isn't based on some sort of physical attributes, but it's actually based on behavior, and you've inherited it. Now, this went to one of its furthest extents in the 1990s, I think it was, within Texas, where the state legislature passed a law which basically said that anyone who was a convicted rapist should be sterilized. And their premise was, which is depressing given the fact that there's no evidence to support this, but nonetheless, in the popular view, this was fairly popular in Texas at the time, was simply due to the fact that they thought, well, if you sterilize everyone who's a rapist, then the intent to be a rapist will disappear in society because you get rid of that, quote, trait, unquote. So sociobiology is a hugely important way that most people view the world around them. And they view behaviors as being inherited, literally in your DNA coding or whatever. No evidence to support it, and it's not part of the behavioral sciences. But nonetheless, it is part of the popular world that people live in. The idea of space, region, and culture horse. Back in even Herodotus, back in 2,000 years ago, when he was writing about other groups of people around him, had the idea that when you were talking about a group, there was some sort of spot, which was where that group's attitudes and values were more consistent and stronger and more powerful. And in the 18th and 19th century, when geography sort of grew back up again, not surprisingly during European colonialism, which of course geography was explicitly tied to. There again was this idea of what became called in that period of time culture horse. This sort of dropped in geography by the 1920s and 30s. It's still really popular in the general sort of perception of the world around them, especially again in the Western intellectual tradition. The idea that someplace there's an area where that group is more crystal clear. There's less confusion, there's less variation, there's less diversity. In the American stereotype of American society, in the American geographic pattern, that would be the Midwest. And you see this because this is why politicians, when they're running for president or something like that, you first go to the Midwest, you go places like Ohio and Iowa and stuff like that, and you PR those folks, because if you can, there's some sort of attitude that if those folks like you and support you, then everyone else will, because that's where the most Americans are. It would be in this sort of Midwest thing. I have no idea who wrote that up initially, but it's now part of sort of a tradition, and you can actually see this in news reports where something happens there, then people get more freaked out about it than they do in, say, California, New York, or say here, where it's considered, well, you guys are sort of fringe, you're not really part of, sort of what you might call pure Americans. Most culture groups, especially in modern nation states, have some sort of idea of a place like that, where they're more they're more themselves and there's less other influences in. And they tend to react as, they tend to be very aggressive about attempts to change that. So culture hearths are part of geography. Geographers came up with the concept, or maybe more formally popularized it. It became central to geography. If you read, for some reason, you read a 100-year-old textbook of, say, Europe or someplace like that, they'll actually use the term of culture hearths and where those are. So for example, they're around Paris would be the French culture hearth. So it's a big thing in geography tied to the idea of space and region. That in a region, somehow there's going to be a spot where that thing, whatever it is you're looking at, is more concentrated. Having said that, as geography sort of grew up in the late 20th century, there became more and more confusion about that. And it really became obvious, as with ethnocentrism, it was sort of like, well, what are you picking? What's your measure? What's your parameter that you're looking at? Because then these things would be all over the place. They really didn't work the way that they were intended. Having said that, of course, there's still a huge issue when you're talking about social media, politics, and all sorts of other areas like advertising. Last of these is invention or innovation versus diffusion. And this sort of deals with the whole idea that, and again, this is not peculiar to geography, but geographers get heavily involved in this because oftentimes geographers will try to map out when a thing was thought of versus where it diffused or moved to. And this is obviously a big thing, for example, in sort of private, well, government and private sectors in terms of things like marketing, distribution, all sorts of things like this. So it has huge importance in what you might call the business or economic reality. So the idea of invention versus diffusion. Invention is the idea that folks in a particular place actually came up with one idea on their own. Diffusion is that folks in a particular place acquired this because someone from somewhere else came over, told them about them, or else they saw it on YouTube or whatever it might be, and so they figured out how to use it. Now, where this becomes really sort of surreal, it goes back, hopped up to sociobiology, because there's a very strong, again, in the Western tradition, that if folks in a particular way, a particular location, think of it on their own, they're somehow smarter. If they acquire it by virtue of getting someplace else, they basically copied it, so therefore they're not as smart. Back in the 70s through the 90s, this was a huge part of the American stereotype of Japanese, because at that point, Japanese, the economic system, Japanese, business and management and products were starting to swamp the American market, and Americans weren't doing very well. American cars looked like crap compared to their Japanese counterparts. So the way that Americans felt better about themselves was to stereotype Japanese as folks that are really good at taking something, borrowing it, and improving it, which also sort of bluntly implied that they couldn't think of new stuff. And the attitude was, well, Americans are so bright and so clever, they're constantly thinking of new stuff, but they don't have the time to improve it. Whereas the Japanese, since they couldn't think of new stuff, had the time to improve it. So therefore, on one hand, everyone might want to buy a Japanese car because they're, more methodical about how they build it. But the parts that make up a car had to be invented by Americans. That would be a classic example of invention versus diffusion. Now, notice how then, of course, it not only ties back to sociobiology, the idea that people basically are more smart, are more creative, are more this or more that, and other groups aren't. But it also applies back then to stereotypes and ethnocentrism. And it's pervasive in the modern world. And one of the sad things about social media and the internet world we live in is you see this happening all the time, even to a greater extent. The amount of sort of naive, we made this, you didn't type stuff, you copied it from us type stuff, is inherent in the way that people seem to posture in the 21st century. The Chinese government right now in 2021 is really big on pushing that they think of everything on their own, which is pretty silly for a bunch of reasons, both historic and just real. But nonetheless, their way of posturing that the Chinese system and the China in 2021 is better than any place else is based very heavily on invention. They can't admit that another group might have actually came up with the idea and they modified it, because that would mean they're not, quote, as smart because they didn't think of it on their own. Very, very weird when you actually look at it. Having said that, it's really terrifying when you start to pay attention to it, how often this pops up in terms of a way to judge others and a way to both sort of hypervalue yourself. So these are sort of the last of these sort of, skewed ways that we view the world around us. That sort of falls into the rubric of bias, but also as many of these are pretty much sort of inherent in the Western intellectual tradition. You do see them in geography.